the consciousness and the soul, you mean to say? Of course, consciousness is a very general term, which you apply. The whole idea of mysticism is to evolve the consciousness from one area of being to the other. So the evolution of consciousness is precisely what mysticism is about. In other words, you first have a consciousness in which your physical being predominates. And somewhere, Moshe says he always loves this kind of very homely comparisons. And so he says, if you say to a child, where is the boy? Then he will point to himself. It is his physical being that is, of course, is his being. So his consciousness is focused on his physical being. Now, unfortunately, we must say, unless we are all ascetics, most of us, this lasts lifelong, that the emphasis on the physical being is inevitable in the human being. Because you have to function through that physical being. You have to eat and drink and rest and whatever. So that physical being is always one which opposes itself upon you. And opposes itself, in other words, on your conscience, on your consciousness as the main part of your being. But of course, it helps an enormous bit if, in addition to that consciousness of the purely physical consciousness, you develop a consciousness, and in most people that is with their education, it is quite a spontaneous process. But with people on the spiritual path, people on mysticism, it's not just spontaneous, it's done very consciously. And mind you, very often, sometimes, I must have told you that before, that mysticism is something like a secret service, in the sense that you notice all these things in particular, which people just take for granted and don't pass by. Psychology has the same thing, mysticism is the same. They start noticing things which everybody is familiar with and everybody deals with or passes through without really giving much attention to it. So the mystic will say, your consciousness, first of your mind, which develops with your education. When a child grows up, then generally that mind, according to his educational level, according to his outlook on life, starts developing in many different directions. And as you know, another important point with Moshe also is that for him intuition is even it precedes intellectual understanding. He says, let me quote that again, I just mentioned it just now also, Moshe says frequently that the mind is the surface, the mind is the surface of the heart, and the heart is the depth of the mind. So they form that second level, which Moshe in this lecture denotes as the jinn level, that mid-level of between the physical and the soul's level. There is that level of the jinn, and that is to Moshe the one, twofold one, of the intellect on the surface, of the intuition in the depth. And there he says, well, intuition always precedes intellect. Why? Because the things you start doing in life, the things you start reaching out for, the things you want to achieve in life, it all proceeds from your particular taste. Why you, as a young person, have a certain taste for doing something, to want to become something, to a particular direction you want to study or you want to acquire. All that is, in first instance, really an intuitive thing. You want to do that. It is your heart which speaks. And your heart is always open to that impulse of the soul. The third level, all the same, has a communication with the depth of the second level, with the heart. So there is that kind of tendency of reaching out, of wanting something, and the purely intuitive element of wanting something then becomes rationalized in your intellect. And people mostly recognize, yes, I wanted to do all this, and, this was my focus and all that. I think it's a purely intellectual development, but in fact, it started all with intuition. Now, that is the second level of consciousness. So in addition to your physical consciousness, if you can enrich your physical awareness with that consciousness of your mind and of your heart, and that plays a decisive role in your whole approach to life, and your approach to your fellow man, and your approach to your own spiritual development, that already is a very important point. And as you see, so many of Moshe's lectures deal precisely with this element of this how should we say that, of having this middle level of the mind and the heart, of the intellect and intuition, joined into an active element, so that both the physical existence is enriched, but at the same time the soul's, something is opened up to that third level of the soul's being. And so there again, coming back to your question about the consciousness, allow that consciousness in the course of your life gradually to shift ever further inwards, and allow these inner levels of your being, the jinn level and the angel level, as Moses calls them in this lecture, allow them ever to play a larger part in your consciousness. So when your consciousness in that sense increases more and more in the sense of the abstract, of grasping a more abstract level, the same thing, but at a more abstract level. So that is what prepares one for that third sense of consciousness, which is the fulfillment of mysticism, being conscious of the life of the soul. And again, the life of the soul has two different aspects. It will be, so to speak, the crowning consciousness of your physical being, being able to evolve, to integrate your consciousness of the soul's life into that of your spirit and your body. But at the same time, it's also that Funklein Gottes, that divine element in man. So, as from that, starting out with that which is the fulfillment of your physical being and your mental being, yet further it expands into that consciousness of divine being, which of course is well beyond. You are conscious of the ray of the sun, but the more conscious you are of the ray, the more conscious you become of the sun itself. The more intense that sun becomes into yourself. That's the way one might be able to say this. All words, of course, in a sense, are approximations that we always have to remember. But at the same time, maintaining that development of consciousness and maintaining that image you have of divine reality, whichever image it is, if it's a personalized or a less personal, of course, that's what we meet in the development and the Sufi practices. You go from the most to the less personal development of divine comprehension. But that is the course in which your consciousness finds its fulfillment. And generally speaking, mysticism is first realized in the soul as part, and let us say the crowning part of the human being. And don't forget, for many people, that already is a great effort to make the concept of the soul a reality. For many people, already is a great achievement. You know, as I said, for the development of the intellect, that's fairly spontaneous, that you learn through training, through all kinds of forms of exercising your mind. You acquire a certain intellectual proficiency. Intuition may already be there. The heart's level very often, as Moshe already says, may be present in many people who have not developed that intellectual, because the intellect, of course, is always divisive. You have to distinguish things in order to comprehend them. So it will always be a divisive quality, but you have people who already have in themselves that depth of the mind, that heart quality of feelings, which is already present in them. And so they will have no problems with the consciousness of the intellect either. So that kind of person is always there. We'll always remember that. I don't mean to say that because you develop your intellectual comprehension, you become in any way better placed or better in whatever way than a person who has not that development. As long as the development of the heart is there, then the intuitive faculty is there. That is what really is even more important than that of the mind. But still, these things are within the range of human evolution. Now, of course, nowadays, even human evolution is not disregarded very much, but everything is purely practical, purely materialistic, purely practical. So even the normal human evolution has taken a rather a turn to the worse, one could say, not by intention, but by implication that has happened. And that's one thing in which one should be very conscious of, trying to have the mind and heart consciousness, as you said, developed yes, because one wishes to, one knows that there is a development there which is necessary. But of course, for the soul's level, that's not something which you can so easily provide. That remains, well, really an achievement of its own. And as I always say, people are fully willing to devote many years of training to, let us say, at the tertiary studies at the third level of knowledge, academic or in any other capacity, or they are fully willing to undergo many trainings, let us say, in art on the subject of the feelings. And when they're training it, so there, many years of training and of practice and of exercise, one takes it perfectly for granted. But then very often people think that, yes, the level of the soul, the third level, that should be done as a kind of free time observation. Well, unfortunately, we have not got more time available than free time. But I remember very well once we discussed this problem with our very valued fellow Sufi from Moscow, Jalaluddin Moskalyev. And we discussed that in previous times, even in the time that Inayat Khan lived, things were so much more simple because you had lots of people who did not really work. They had these so-called leisure classes. To begin with, all women belonged to it, and many men also worked at a lesser rate or were pensioned earlier, etc. So they said, yes, it was much easier for the leisure classes with the 3 monthly summer schools in Suren to cultivate that people have it today. Where Jalaluddin Moskalyev said very nicely, but once you are pensioned, everybody becomes leisure class. Well, I must say it is the experience of many pensioners that they feel they are more busy after their pension than before. So that's a warning we should always reckon with. But at the same time, it is true that, of course, a very consistent way of study. I mean, if you are ready to devote to either your intellectual development in scholarship, at academic level, let us say, or an artistic development through the feeling of heart and taste and all that of your heart, all these things, you are perfectly willing to devote many years to it, and devote during these years a lot of time to it. And of course, as I say, mysticism can be experienced at many, many different levels also. But if you wish to develop not only as a kind of spontaneous phenomenon that may be there or not there, and you might be aware of it or not, because of course one can be aware in certain conditions of the life of the soul when the mind and the feelings of the heart, the thoughts of the mind, the physical awareness are a bit lessened, then something of that soul's experience may already be there. But in order to develop it consciously, and especially to maintain it, and there again in Inayat Khan's mystic Sufism, that's why I always call it Indian Sufism, it is very much about, ecstasy. You achieve something and it remains there with you. As any kind of knowledge or any kind of sense of achievement remains with you. It's something you have acquired, and it's always there. Whereas the so-called ecstatic, which is the non-Indian, is very often the ecstatic mode of rising above oneself and being conscious of an inner reality is wonderful, but it comes and goes. It's not something which is permanently there. It is something which comes and goes and which you have to evolve all the time in you. And of course, for people who are fortunate enough to be able to afford a kind of permanent awareness of inner reality, that becomes more and more easy throughout time. But all things simply have very different levels of reality. And it is not if you have a slight level of reality, that doesn't mean that it has not its own function and value as well. As I always say, it's all kind of things you must have heard me say, I don't know how many times before. But anyway, it is so. Take medicine. All of us may, if we may have a little plaster or a little balm or something, we go to the whatever you call it, this people who have to, you buy these kind of little medicines for your cough or for your cold or for something. Okay, everybody has sufficient knowledge of medicine to go buy himself something to against his cold or whatever, or a little wound and he has a plaster. Well, we know that much. But that doesn't make us surgeons able to do, brain operations or things like that. So we are all at a level of different levels of medicine, of medical knowledge. But the fact that one is not a medical surgeon does not bar one from buying, a kind of pill for your cold. So there are different levels in which a certain knowledge applies as well. So even if one cannot be a full-timer with all these possibilities which in practical life one may not have, one may have sufficient values, awareness of the soul's life to integrate them in the life you follow. And the wonderful thing of Inayat's teaching is precisely that is what he aims at. He wants to give people something they can live with throughout their lives, not just to, become a separate specialist in a particular field and go on living in that field all the time, but to integrate mysticism and the level of the awareness of the soul within the consciousness you have of your everyday personality. He's very specifically, he says, it's not about renouncing life, it's not going into something, but do integrate that sense of awareness in your everyday life. And then, of course, he says somewhere, that those passages as well. He says that, it's meditation, if you sit down for meditation for a little while and you forget all about it for the rest of the day, it's like a person who goes to church on Sundays and forgets everything about religion the rest of the week. But that's all people that think that meditation, then once they've done it, they should go, then Murshid meditate all day long. But what Murshid means is maintain that awareness of your meditation throughout the day. It doesn't necessarily mean that when you do all kind of things, you meditate all along. You come into that kind of religious repetitiveness. And religious repetitiveness, especially not the thing which Murshid means. What it means is once you get attunement, carry something of that attunement with you along the day. And not continue that practice along the day, of course. So these things one has to be very, very aware what Murshid means. Otherwise, you make yourself many more difficulties than the Murshid intended. Because the wonderful thing is that Murshid is a teacher. He teaches you things, but he evokes things which are even more important. Start by taking in what Murshid says by way of teaching, but then realize that the impulses, the evocative spirit, the whole poetical sense which informs those words and those teachings are an even more abiding element in your spiritual attunement. So, from that point of view, enjoy your time whenever you take up Inayat's teachings, inshallah.